So, when it comes to teaching listening lessons, there's a question that I commonly get asked by teachers. And in this video, I want to share a little bit of advice in response to that question. And that question is, if I'm teaching a listening lesson, what do I do if my students just don't understand the audio? This is a really understandable question. And I know that this particular concern is what holds a lot of teachers back from doing more listening comprehension work in their lessons. And honestly, I've experienced this before myself, and so I get that there's still always that little bit of fear there going into a listening lesson. What if, even after I set clear tasks for the listening stages, even if I play the audio track multiple times, what if my students just still don't understand? What if they still aren't able to do the listening tasks that I give them or answer the comprehension questions? What do we do then? So, obviously, a situation like that could be discouraging for your students and probably not very comforting for you as the teacher either. But there are some things that you can do to help with this situation. So, let's go ahead and dive into, first of all, why this might be happening, and then we'll get into some strategies for how to deal with this situation. And just in case you're new here, hey, welcome, I'm Shannon. I have worked as an ESL teacher trainer for many years now. And if you are an ESL teacher, particularly somebody who works with adult ESL students, and you're looking for online teaching techniques that are practical and easy to implement, then go ahead and subscribe to this channel because I put out more videos pretty much weekly, just like this one. Okay, so let's go ahead and get back to the topic at hand, which is that big question. What can you do if you're teaching a listening lesson, you play the audio track, and it just seems like no matter how many times you play it or what you do, your students just don't understand? So, the first thing I recommend is to check whether you need to fine tune a couple of your teaching techniques when it comes to helping your students with listening comprehension. There are a couple of common mistakes I often see new teachers make in listening lessons, or maybe we can call them misconceptions in terms of teachers thinking they should do something that's actually not that helpful for the students. So, if you are somebody who is doing any of these things, don't worry, because these issues are really pretty easy to fix as soon as you know what to do instead. So, for example, something that's really important to do in a listening lesson is to establish context before students listen to the audio track. It's also really important to set a clear task for each listening stage. So, in other words, giving your students guidance as to exactly what you want them to listen for before you actually push play on that audio. So, if you're not doing those things, then it's going to make the whole process of understanding what they're hearing especially challenging. I actually made a separate video where I go into way more detail on each of these common issues and suggest really helpful solutions. So the first step, if you haven't already watched that video, is to go ahead and watch that one just to eliminate those things as potential factors here. Okay, so now, assuming you've watched that video and all of that has been taken care of, so you're setting context, you're setting clear tasks for the audio, you're playing the audio track multiple times, what if your students are still struggling? The next thing I would suggest is to ask yourself, what is it exactly about that particular audio track that you think might be difficult for them to understand? And you can even ask yourself this question in your planning process. In fact, I would recommend that you try to anticipate this in your planning process. For example, if I'm worried that my students are going to have trouble understanding a particular audio track, before I even teach the lesson in my preparation, I'm going to ask myself that question. So, what is it exactly here that I think is going to trip them up? Is it that the speaker has a certain accent my students aren't used to? Is it a conversation between two people where both speakers are talking very quickly and using a lot of connected speech where their words are kind of getting slurred together? Are there maybe a lot of slang words or colloquialisms in the conversation that I think my students probably won't know? Or is it something else or some combination of all of these factors? So, obviously, before you're actually in the lesson and the audio is actually playing, you might not be 100% sure as to what exactly the reason could be, right? Or you might not even know whether or not your students are going to have trouble with that particular audio track at all. But either way, I find it helpful to at least try to anticipate this because once you have a clearer idea of what the actual problem with the audio is, right? What exactly is it that's causing your students to struggle? It's much easier to try to preempt or deal with that issue. So, to go back to some of those example issues, if you think the problem is that the speakers are talking really quickly in the audio recording, you could warn your students about that ahead of time. So, right from the start, before you even push play, you could tell the students that the speakers are going to be talking very quickly and that they probably won't be able to catch everything. So that way, the students go into it, even the very first time they listen, knowing in advance that you're not expecting them to understand everything. They have some warning going in. So that could help eliminate that kind of negative surprise, right? That very first time they hear speech that's much faster than they were expecting. If, on the other hand, you think the issue is that there's a lot of unknown vocabulary or slang or colloquialisms in the audio, then you could pre teach some of those unknown vocab items before diving into the listening exercise. So, the point here is really that the more specific you can be about the anticipated problem, whatever you anticipate the difficulty for your students to be, right? Not just, I'm afraid my students won't understand, but what exactly you think will cause this, then the more likely it is that you'll be able to deal with this and actually help your students through it in the way that you structure and approach the listening stages in your lesson. My third piece of advice here is to consider reframing how you think about listening lessons in general. So, we know that it's not realistic to expect our students to understand every single word the first time they listen to the audio. But even by the end of the lesson, it's really not necessary for the students to have understood every detail, even to have gotten a lot out of that listening experience. Remember that the goal in practicing listening comprehension is progress, not perfection. And so, our goal as teachers is just to guide students through this process of practicing their listening comprehension skills, right? Not to focus on the final product of exactly how much they understood. So, as long as we're not teaching in a more specific context like exam prep, then we're really not assessing our students on the percentage of the audio or the number of words that they were able to understand, or even really the number of comprehension questions that they were able to get correct. It's all about just letting students practice playing the audio multiple times so that they can hear a little bit more in response to whatever task you've set each time. So, a great way to guide the students through this process that I'm talking about is to use what Jim Scrivener calls the task feedback circle. How this works is that you set a clear task for each listening stage, and the tasks typically should progress from more general and therefore less challenging to more detailed, which probably means more challenging. And then for each task, you're just guiding students through the same cycle, where first you set the task and let students listen alone to try to do that task. Then you allow students to discuss their answers in pairs. So if you're teaching online, this does mean putting them into breakout rooms. And then the next step is to bring the whole group back together and go over the answers. What's important here is that instead of just going through the motions, just waiting while the students are in their breakout rooms and then just giving them the correct answers during feedback, you want to be really proactive in paying close attention to how the students are doing and feeling during each of these steps. So, in my lessons, while my students are doing the pair check, I'm actively monitoring by going from room to room, or if you're teaching in person, great, you can just walk around the room and listen in a little bit on each pair's discussion. And so while I'm doing this, I'm making a mental note of how the students did on the task. It's difficult, of course, to get a completely accurate read on every single student's answers, but I can usually get at least a pretty good sense of overall how difficult my students found the audio and the task, and even which aspects of the task, or maybe even which particular questions, they found the most challenging. So while I'm listening in, I'm not interjecting, I'm just listening, and I might hear my students saying things like, oh, wow, I couldn't understand anything. That was way too fast. Or maybe, okay, number one, I got, but did you hear the answer to number two? I totally missed it. All of those kinds of comments give you really valuable information about how the students did on the task and how confident they're feeling about it. So from there, when I bring the group back together to go over the answers for feedback, then I'm going to get even more information. So if I try to elicit the answer for the task and all of my students answer correctly and confidently, then I know they did well and I can move on to the next task. But if they don't seem so confident in the answer, If most of my students say that they couldn't really hear the answer or the answers if there were multiple questions, or maybe only some of the students feel confident about the different questions on the task, okay, then that's a good indication that we need to stay on this task, this stage, a little bit longer and listen again for that same task. And here's another really important tip when using the task feedback circle. So if your students are not confident about all of the answers for that particular task, don't just give them the answers anyway and then move on to the next task. So let's say, just as an example, that my students were all very confident about the answer to question 1, but only some of them seemed confident in their answer to question 2, and hardly any of them really seemed confident at all or are saying that they even heard the answer for question 3. So as the teacher, one option would be to just tell them, yes, this is correct for question 1, and here's the answer for 2, and here's the answer for 3. But instead of doing that, instead of confirming the right answer for number 2 and telling them the answer for question 3, I'm going to hold off on this. Instead, I can confirm they got question 1 correct since they were confident about that one. But then I can say, okay, now let's listen again just for questions 2 and 3 to see if you can hear more information. After the students listen again, they then go back into their pairs in their breakout rooms in order to discuss once again any additional information that they heard in answer to those 2 questions. So this is the task feedback circle in action. We're making decisions and pacing the lessons based on what's actually happening in the moment, based on how our students are doing with the listening. And we're using that information to decide whether we're ready to move on or whether we need more time on that particular task. And don't underestimate the power of those pair checks. You'd be surprised how much they really help. Sometimes what I'll notice when I'm teaching or observing a lesson is that after the audio is played for the first time and the teacher says, okay, now go to your breakout rooms and check with your partner, the students will say, wait, can we listen again? I didn't understand everything. My advice there, if that happens, would be to reassure your students, don't worry, you'll have a chance to listen again, but even if you didn't understand everything for this task, or even if you couldn't understand enough to answer all of the questions, that's okay. Just talk to your partner about what you did hear. Just talk together and get the answers to as many of the questions as you can. Because you'll notice once you actually start listening in on those breakout room conversations that the students actually did understand a lot. And by talking it out with somebody else, with their partner, they're able to bring up a lot of key words and they're able to help each other get more information that they heard in relation to the questions that they're trying to answer. So you'll hear students say things to their partner like, oh, wait, you heard that word for question 3? Okay, I didn't hear that word, but I'm going to listen again and I'm going to see if I hear it this time. So all of that stuff coming up is going to help them, right? It's going to support them, give them clues about more things to listen for in the next listening round. So this is why the task feedback circle is so powerful, because the students are essentially setting the pace of the lesson for you. And with those pair checks, they're helping each other in understanding a little bit more each time. And as the teacher, you don't have to feel like you're just guessing about how much they understood or just going through the motions and wondering if it's actually helping. You're getting real valuable information each time the students listen about what they need and how they're progressing. Okay, another piece of advice if you're worried about your students just not understanding the audio is this. Grade the task, not the text. What I mean by grade here is simplify, like the grade of difficulty, not grade as in assess. And so what I mean by that is that you really can't control the difficulty of the actual audio track because it's pre-recorded. I mean, I guess technically you could use some sort of technology to slow down the speed of the track, but let's assume that the point here is to help students practice with the audio at the regular speed. So that means the audio track essentially is what it is, right? You really can't control or change that. You can't change the difficulty if the speakers are talking very quickly. But what you can control is what you ask the students to do with that audio track. You're in charge of the comprehension tasks, the comprehension questions. So if you're concerned that the audio is really difficult, then maybe don't ask questions that require the students to understand every single detail. Design tasks that you think the students will be able to do, at least after a couple rounds of listening, questions that you think they can answer that don't require them to understand every single word. So if there's a particular part of that audio that's super fast or maybe super subtle or has a crazy amount of connected speech or contains a phrase that's almost impossible to understand because of a particular accent or something, then maybe don't ask a ton of really detailed comprehension questions about that particular part, right? And if you do want to focus on that particular super difficult section, then maybe come back to that part of the audio later, maybe more near the end of your lesson, where you can really dive in and dissect it after you've built students' confidence with the other, more general, less challenging tasks that they were able to do first. So I think the take-home message here is that you're in control of this, right? Even if there are audio tasks already made for you in the book, you're not necessarily married to those tasks. You don't have to do those tasks. You can adapt them, you can change them. The only exception here, again, is if you're teaching listening for exam prep, then yes, I would fully advise you to proceed through the audio exercises in the exact same way that students will be taken through the audio during the actual exam, and that's a different thing. What I'm talking about in this video is helping your students with listening in more general English lessons. And I think in that case, sometimes as teachers, we don't really take as much agency as we could to take more control over the lesson and really help our students through more difficult aspects of the material. All right, and then finally, if you have an audio track that's just really difficult, and even after you've played the audio multiple times using the task feedback circle, you could consider working with that audio track using subtitles or the transcript at the end of the lesson. So remember, you don't want to rely on subtitles or the transcript near the beginning of the lesson, because if you give the students the transcript the first or even the second or even the third time they listen, they end up really just reading. They're not really developing listening comprehension at that stage because they have the words right there in front of them. But if it's something where the students have listened many times already just to the audio and they're still feeling a bit frustrated or like there was just a lot that they couldn't understand, then this can be a useful practice, maybe as kind of the final stage in the listening process, where students get to listen one final time or maybe a couple final times with the transcript. And from there, that could be a really cool jumping off point, even into some work with vocabulary or connected speech. So, for example, often if I teach a lesson based on authentic listening material, like a short clip from a movie or episode in a series, even my advanced students will still have parts of it that they don't understand, no matter how many times we listen, because there's a lot of connected speech or colloquial vocabulary. It's material that's not designed for language learners. So after we go through all of the actual listening stages, I'll let my students listen again with the transcript in front of them, and I'll ask them to do an activity where they highlight or underline or mark any phrases where they think the sound, what they're hearing, is much different than the words that they're seeing. So this is a great way for me to let my students kind of take charge and point out phrases in English where how proficient speakers pronounce it in very fast, fluid, natural speech sounds way different than how the words look written on paper. So once they've chosen some of the ones that stand out to them, we'll take a look at those phrases and the features of connected speech at play in those phrases when they're spoken quickly, and then we'll do some modeling and drilling with connected speech. So this is a really fun, satisfying way for my students to end the lesson feeling like they were able to understand more at the end, right? There weren't just these mystery phrases left floating around. And it's a nice way to prepare them to be better able to hear that really fast connected speech in the future. All right, I hope this was helpful, and I hope this gives you a little bit more confidence in approaching your listening lessons and feeling a little bit less worried about that "what if my students don't understand" concern. And always remember that even if your students don't understand everything, perfection or 100% comprehension is never the goal. It's still so valuable for you to help your students progress in their listening comprehension skills. All right, do you still have any questions about teaching listening comprehension or listening lessons in general? Let me know in the comments if you do, and I'll see you next time.